The story he relates about the USS Indianapolis was a real thing that happened. That really did. That was a ship that was delivering the atomic bomb to an air base off the coast of Japan in order to deliver that atomic bomb. And so you have within that, obviously the people on that ship were delivering a bomb, a weapon of mass destruction. And then this terrible thing happened, which I actually had that several years ago. I wrote a short story that had that incident in it as part of what happened to one of the characters. So I was familiar with that, and also from just reading history, because it's a terrible thing. The thing is that those people were left out in the ocean, I think, for close to a week.
Yeah, that's what he says, is that they didn't even put out a distress signal. No one came for them.
Right. They were there for a long time, and planes had to land on the ocean, from what I understand, had to land on the ocean, and then they would strap people to the wings of the aircraft and then to get them out of there.
That's insane.
I mean, 700 people dead, eaten by sharks. Not all of them, I assume, were eaten by sharks,
of course,
and probably drowned or died from exposure or dehydration or whatever. But I mean, it's a terror that's almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've ever been, it's almost unimaginable to spend a week in the middle of the ocean of shark-infested waters, watching the day come, the night come, the day come, the night come. It's almost unimaginable. It's
and then
to
watching
deal with that.
Your crew die alongside you is the other element to that. Is that you saw people. If you're around all these people, there's people that would just say, "I can't anymore," and they just stop swimming or whatever.
I think there were people that would have gone insane. I think that some people would have lost their minds in the water. And then, imagine
it must have
being
been a scene of true horror,
in the middle of the night, in the middle of the ocean, after your ship, by the way, has been destroyed by an enemy vessel.
Yeah.
Forget about that. That's already, that's just the beginning of the terror. And then you're treading water or whatever, and they have life jackets. Well, they do. Remember, he says in the movie, "I'll never wear a life jacket again," because he can't stand the idea of even putting a life jacket on, I guess, because he had to deal with that. And then imagine trying to survive that if the person next to you has lost their mind.
I don't think
that's
people
interesting.
Can understand that. I don't.
No, I don't. I think you would have to live through that to understand.
I say that, but it's not that I understand it. There's only in our society, in our world, for the most part, that we live in as people, not our whole world, but our personal worlds. You only get tiny little glimpses of what that's like, and most of us ignore them. We ignore glimpses of horror because they're horror. They're horrific, and we don't want to face the reality that there's a dark, hideous part of life that's always on the edge of our world. I mean, when I'm walking around and I see homeless people that are very clearly in the throes of a schizophrenic fit, and they're just they just look like they're degrading, and they're screaming at no one in particular, essentially at God in the sky is what you end up, cursing when you're that far in the depths of being plagued by your own demons. And that's it's funny because I was at a coffee shop the other day, and this is kind of just a normal part of living in LA, is someone having a mental breakdown across the street while you're working at a cafe or something. And I remember there was two guys in the about 4 hours I was there was two separate people that walked by the cafe just screaming at the sky. And what people do in those moments is everybody kind of tightens up. You feel how everyone in the cafe kind of just tightens up just a little bit and quiets. It just becomes just slightly quieter. And it's almost like a funeral procession. There's this really eerie element to what happens when you see someone that is really in a dark place passing along the edges of normal society, because they're not with you. They're not in the same world. They're not in the same society. They're living there, yeah, physically, but they're not part of society. They're on the outside of society, and society is everyone, in the coffee shop doing things, whatever, integrated, accepted, following the rules, not screaming at the sky. You can't do that because immediately that's not the rules of society. You put people on edge when you do that. And so everybody kind of tightens up. And I think it's an interesting example of how scared we are of just the slightest hints of how dark life can get. Because that's dark.
It's context. I think, there's a few things about that. Number one, we can, on this podcast, we can rant and there was a Tim Dillon episode recently who he's a comedian. I think he's great, and he's good. It was entitled "Scream at the Sky." So there's an appropriate context to "Scream at the Sky." So I can yell and rant about Jaws victim blaming and eating hippies and all that kind of stuff, and it's obviously a comedic episode, right? Now, if I were to walk down the sidewalk screaming about that, it would be a different thing. And so the other thing is, I think that people get quiet when they see that, not just because they know that there are scenarios in which they too could lose their mind and be that person. Everyone knows, and it is true, that there is a pathway to madness for every human being.
That's the scripture, there by the grace of God go I, which again,
you're doing a lot of scripture quoting this time. And I think really making up some stuff too. I think you're just making up some some Jaws misinformation.
That one's real though, because I love that one, because that's essentially what it means. It's don't be so arrogant, to think that another person's misfortune is beyond you, because everybody is a human being. You are at risk. Jaws isn't. And Jaws is not a schizophrenic. Jaws is not homeless either. So Jaws is not at risk of the same problems that humans are. But we are. If there's it's a problem. It's an arrogance, and it's a defense against dealing with that horror of human life, is that, well, it wouldn't happen to me. Maybe.
It's not just that, though. It's also you go quiet when you see madness around you because you don't want to attract the eye of madness.
Of course.
So you don't want to actually say something it's exactly that. You don't want to make a sound or a thing because you know that it may attract the attention of that person, who then fixates upon you in their mind, thinking, who knows what connections are going on in their mind, right? There's a danger to it. I mean, I have been about areas of society where... So I think I mentioned this before in a podcast, where I was in a psychology class a long time ago. And we went into a mental institution during college for a psychology class, and we met and talked to people that were imprisoned for crime, but they were in a separate unit because of psychological illness.
Oh no, I don't think you've mentioned that on the podcast.
Maybe I didn't, but anyway. Maybe I didn't, but anyway. Well, we don't need to delve into that. But the point is,
drop that.
Well,
what's
I mean,
the relation?
It wasn't like I was only there for a few hours. The relation is, it was just, there is this weird kind of quiet, almost reverent posture people take when they are not insane, and they're amongst those who have been claimed by madness, and you walk carefully. And I mean, it wasn't unsafe to be there. There are obviously guards, and these people weren't at I don't actually know. I mean, I'm sure they weren't immediately dangerous to anybody, or I assume they wouldn't have allowed us to go talk to them. But, and I remember a guy who just looked at me. I was walking along, and he just looked at me and said, "I am Jesus Christ." I'm like, okay, that's a pretty common thing to, I think, get.
We've spoken about that in the last Hereditary podcast, part 2, the hyper-religious. Yeah, right. I think that's the one where we speak about there's a certain like psychosis and schizophrenia, and I think a certain version of mania that present with these hyper-religious, particularly psychosis is the
Messiah complex.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's exactly what it's called, but it becomes an obsession with religion. But psychosis is the one where people really have this. It occurs commonly where people believe they are either Jesus, God or Satan, or that they are inside, those figures are inside them. Really interesting how that, well, this goes, I mean, if anybody's interested in this idea of like how demons plague you both metaphorically and literally, you got to watch the part 2 Hereditary, because we go into all of that with that. So I'm not even going to bother going into it, because we'll just end up doing the podcast again.
Yeah, we've sidetracked. I would say...
No, but I really like that idea, though, about the idea how people take this reverential stance around a person that's clearly in the depths of suffering or madness, particularly.